The coastal village of Longniddry in East Lothian has been a settlement for over 5,000 years. Over time, the unearthing of artefacts, bones and ancient structures has offered a fascinating insight into Longniddry's very distant past. But for the people in the village today, it is family history that is most cherished. In these recollections, there are many connections to the past, intertwined with joy, pride, and perhaps most importantly, human experience. This film, created on behalf of Salt of the Earth, has been made as a record for current and future generations, preserving the remarkable stories of this very special place. Our first subject is Mr. John McDougall.
I've lived in the village for 63 years, basically all my life. My grandfather was Claude Haddon McDougall, C.H. McDougall, who owned the grocer's shop at 4 Main Street, Longniddry. Claude was born in 1894 in Leith in Edinburgh, and he married my grandmother, Margaret Graham Richardson, at Clayton Parish Church in Lookers in 1920. On his marriage certificate, it said that he was a grocer stroke journeyman, and the journeyman interested me because I didn't know what that was. So having looked that up, it's a ancient trades guilds thing where many of the men in these days were members of societies and guilds, and you were ranked either an apprentice, a journeyman or a master. And at that stage in my grandfather's life, he was obviously a time-served grocer, so he was a journeyman. So during 1920 to 1930, they had 3 of a family. The oldest, Elizabeth, my Auntie Betty, the middle one, John, my father, and the youngest one, Margaret, the daughter. In that time, he progressed his career and became a master grocer. This was reflected in the guilds that he was a member of, the British Order of Ancient Free Gardeners, and also in the Abbotsford Masonic Lodge. The Free Gardeners Guild was independent of the Freemasonry societies, but there were similarities there. And this was, I say, reflected in a medal that he was presented with. There was an opportunity to move to a shop in Longniddry, where one of his cousins lived down this way and had identified the shop as becoming available. And that's the route he decided to take, mainly because my Auntie Betty and my dad were at school in Edinburgh, and he didn't want to interrupt their schooling. So although they moved down to the village around 1936, both my dad and my Auntie Betty went to school in Edinburgh for a while, until certainly my Auntie Betty finished her schooling. I think my dad came down and went to Knox Academy for a short while. So that's how they ended up moving to the village. So he took over the grocer's shop at 4 Main Street from a family called the Millers. It was a provision shop before, so there was not a lot of interior work to do, and he basically got himself settled in there and set up the business. He ran the grocer's business for around 30 years with a van that my dad used to drive around the local community, go to the various farms, Blinkbonny, Southfield, Hoprig, Harelaw, Coates Holdings, just basically anywhere around about. People would either phone into the shop on 139, which was the shop number, became 3131, 3139, 53139, 852, 539, as things progressed. I used to go in the van with my dad at an early age, 4, round these places, and it was great for me because he used to have a wee tin of sweets in the back along with the groceries, and every time we went to someone's house or one of the holdings, the people there would buy me a sweetie. So that's probably why the reason I had rotten teeth early. My grandfather was also very active in the village as an elder in the church, but also with the scouting movement with the Boy Scouts and the Girl Guides, and was awarded the Order of Merit from the Scouts in 1963, having been the group treasurer for a number of years, and so his services to scouting in the county were recognised with a medal. This is the only memento that I have left from my grandfather's shop. It's a set of brass spirit measures, a half pint, a gill, half gill and a quarter gill. And these were checked every year by the Customs and Excise weights and measures to make sure that you were providing the correct levels of spirits. And they're all type marked around the rim for each year that they're checked. And this kind of follows my grandfather's career, because the first one is typed in about 1924 and finishes about 1962. Once the McDougalls had moved down here, there was obviously my Auntie Margaret, my dad, my Auntie Betty, and they all grew up in the village and ended up all marrying and staying in the village. My dad married Georgina Samuel, who was the daughter of Archie and Mary Samuel, my other grandmother and grandfather, and they stayed at 2 Main Street, Longniddry, which was just 2 doors down from the shop. My grandfather worked for the railways. He was a signalman along the line from St Germans down to Drem and the various signal boxes there. This is number 2 Main Street, Longniddry. It's 2 doors down from where my grandfather Claude McDougall had his grocer shop. But this house was where my grandparents on my mother's side, Archie and Mary Samuel, lived. Archie was a worker on the railway for many years. They stayed here for most of their life before moving round to Forthew when this was turned into the Longniddry Inn. When my grandmother wasn't indoors, she spent a lot of her time standing here chatting to the locals going past, and a lot of her time sharpening her knives, and you can see from the groove in the stonework here where she used to sharpen the knives.
As we move from a key part of Longniddry's modern foundations, we hear from Miss Jacqueline Hunter, a lifelong community member with a keen interest in the impact of the World Wars on Longniddry.
This is the Scottish Veteran Garden City Association. The houses are all behind me here, and it was formed in about 1915. Houses were built about then, and the land was donated by the Earl of Weems, and this is classed as the Laird's Garden, and it was the Castle Douglas, which was around about here, and this was the garden. And this area was chosen because it's near the station for the wounded men heading up to the hospitals. And this was the bowling green, the sports area, and there's also a community hut which is further round. And they had a Boy Scout troop that started here in Longniddry, 1919, led by 2 wounded ex-servicemen. They started here. And there's been 3 shops built here too, which are just over to my left. The money was raised by Scottish societies all over the world, and 2 of the houses, which are number 7 and number 8, the money was given over by Canadian First Nations, because there's such a strong connection between Canadian First Nations and Scotland itself because of the Hudson Bay Company. But they formed a regiment in 1915 because the Canadians didn't want them in their regiment, so they formed their own regiment, and they came over here and trained over here, but they wanted to come to Scotland. So they came to Glasgow in 1916, treated like celebrities, came to Edinburgh, treated like celebrities, and they left about £500 in a collection, because by that time they were building the houses here, and so they managed to build 2 houses, which are 1 Mohawk Valley and 2 Mohawk Valley. We've just come down past the shops, of which there are 3 which were part of the original settlement, and throughout the years there have been newsagents and sold clothes, sold wool, because I used to buy my knitting wool there, been a cobbler's and a couple of tea rooms, and the current one at the end, which is now a sandwich shop. Mr. Watt was there in my youth, and he lost both his hands during the First World War, but he managed, I don't know how, managed amazingly, and he learned to paint. The first thing he did when he came out of hospital was go to art school. You know, no hands, but he had rubber bands on his wrists, and he could write, and he must have been able to deal with money in the shop and put stuff on shelves and paint pottery, which he called stump pottery. I'm in Longniddry Parish Church and I'm in front of the war memorials. The ones on either side of me are the First World War, and the second one behind me is the Second World War. And on the First World War, there's 21 boys, mostly from the Glasmere parish, but actually 8 of them are Longniddry boys who worked and lived on Longniddry Farms, Longniddry Main Street, Longniddry Station. And then the one behind me in the Second World War, there's 3 brothers' names, 3 Gitcham brothers, who were friends with my dad, went to school with my dad, and 6 of them went to war and 3 came back. One of the gentlemen, Alec, he was a Japanese prisoner of war, and he just made it home, but he died on the journey home. So he's buried in Aberlady, but his other brother is buried in the Far East. He maybe doesn't even have a grave, but the third brother was killed in Germany, so I believe he might be buried in Germany, which is such a shame for the poor Mr. and Mrs. Gitcham, because the father was a World War I veteran, had been wounded, and then 21 years later, his sons go off to war. I became interested in the First World War gentlemen, or boys as we call them, our boys, in 2018 when it was the 100th anniversary of the ending of World War I. I was involved in the research for our 21 boys. I was involved in making the poppies for the poppy display outside the church. I was involved in making the poppies which were displayed in here, and helping out at there was a service over the weekend, and it made us cry because what my friend was talking about, our boys, and how they lost their lives at quite a young age, and did they leave wives and children. And
like so many villages, Longniddry has seen expansive development over the past century. A byproduct of this allowed for one particularly important organisation to form. Here, Mr. Colin Sked shares his family memories and provides a glimpse into the establishment of the now famous Scottish Women's Rural Institute.
I've lived in Longniddry now, well, my family has, since 1884, and we've been here ever since. Today we're in Gosford Wood, which is within 5 minutes of where I lived and spent most of my life from about 10-year-old until you weren't allowed to come in here anymore. From what I know, and I remember from my great-grandmother talking about it, the rural was first formed in 1917, and which she would have been about 30-year-old at that time. And it started really with a small meeting in the village, just a get-together, and someone brought along a Canadian relative. And she did a talk on the institutes that they have in Canada. She was Canadian. And the institutes they have in Canada. And at the end, nobody spoke, because, as I said, this was a rural village, probably 400, 500 people at the time. And somebody stood up, Mrs. Bathgate, and who, I think she was a farmer or smallholder, and she said, we've got to have one of these institutes. And they got their heads together and they formed it.
it was just a way of ladies meeting and chatting and swapping recipes and crafts and whatever have you. So Mrs. Blair organised the meeting in Longniddry and McMurray, and the Longniddry meeting went ahead because the McMurray ladies had chicken pox or something like that, so they couldn't meet. So Longniddry ended up being the first meeting in Scotland in what is now the cafe, Julie's Cafe. And one of the ladies was a Mrs. Bathgate and a Mrs. Noon, which is Colin's great granny, and they said, I'd like to start the rural, and one of them seconded it.
The bywords at the time was thrift and ingenuity. And effectively from, I started remembering it in 1957. That's when they had their 40th anniversary. And it's just been part of my life because my great-grandmother was part of the founders. My grandmother was heavily into it, and then my mother, and it's just been part of our life. Baking was just you were licking the bowl for 40 years nearly, and it was it's just been something I'm very proud of. Personal memory I've got of the celebrations and the anniversaries of the rural was the 50th anniversary, which was held in Gosford House itself. The reason I remember it is my father, who worked for the agricultural division of Shell, had just received his new Land Rover, and it was a case of, I'll take you all down to Gosford House, no problems, that's sorted. So my dad, my mum and my aunties, who were all part of it, because it was the law if you were part of our family, he basically got them all in the Land Rover, took them down in I think it was called the North Gate, all the way there, and dropped them off at the back. My mum was just cheesing it the whole way. She couldn't believe it, and she'd been searching for a frock for it for months. Anyway, they dropped them off, and my father, being a rather non-conventional type of man, he decided he'd leave the estate with a flourish. Now, rather than follow the one-way system out that the Earl had put in place for the other drivers, he did a loop on the grass in front. Now, unbeknownst to my father, the Earl had moved the pheasant hatchery, which he was doing his flourish through. So he set off, waving to everybody, and all of a sudden, from what I was told, there was this horror from the Earl, who was standing at the top of the steps, and they went in the slow-mo. But my dad just went out, did a roundel, and wiped out the pheasant hatchery for that season. Completely crashed it and left. Another memory I've got of that day is my mother on the balcony at Gosford House. All my aunties, Lady Weems, she is cheesing it, and we've never ever seen her look so happy. Unbeknownst to her, that was the last time she was going to see inside it in her lifetime, because she died, didn't survive much longer after it. But it's a lovely memory, and she looked lovely. For the 50th anniversary, I was a paper boy at the time, and I just remember going to this house in King's Road and delivering my paper, and the door opened, and it was my mother, my grandmother, my great grandmother, and one of their friends, and it was set up, and it was a BBC radio broadcast, and it was getting transmitted from there, and I went, what's going on here? And I just remember coming and listening to it, and I remember that sitting there and listening to my mum, and that was when it really hit me that, goodness me, it was a programme called Scottish Home, and it was rural affairs, and there was my family. It was going out to Scotland, and it really hit home that time. I went, goodness me, because my great grandmother was a very introverted lady, but obviously very strong, and I don't know. I still remember it to this day.
In the late 1990s, a significant artefact relating to the history of Longniddry was gifted to the Longniddry Golf Club, a scrapbook belonging to the late Miss Nancy Jupp. Mr. Peter Lowe has chosen to research her remarkable legacy, which may otherwise have been lost to time.
Nancy Jupp won the 1934 British Girls Amateur Championship at the age of 13 years, 9 months. She is the youngest ever winner of that tournament. She was born in Hendon in London in 1920 and died in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2013. Her father was George William Jupp, a senior civil servant who was born in Somerset in 1875 and died in Longniddry in 1938. Her mother, Ethel Jupp, née Armit, was born in 1881 in Dundee and died in London in 1960. She was an actress and an operatic singer. Nancy had an elder sister, Rhoda, who was born in 1918 and died in 1970. The family moved to Longniddry in May 1921 and became members of Longniddry Golf Club. Indeed, Ethel became the First Lady Captain of Longniddry Golf Club. Nancy was very interested in many sports, but her father took her out onto the links and taught her how to play golf from the age of about 6. In 1929, her father took her to Muirfield to watch the Open Championship, where she saw Walter Hagen hole the winning putt. Post-World War II, she trained as a journalist. She worked in the UK and in Australia before emigrating to the United States in 1956. She worked for Golf Magazine as an editor. She also worked for the United States Golf Association as an associated editor for their magazine. She was also a script writer for Shell's Wonderful World of Golf, which is a well-known TV golf show from the 60s and 70s.
The Pine Valley Golf Club, Pine Valley, New Jersey, one of the most difficult golf courses in the world. A match between Byron Nelson, one of golf's all-time greats, winner of the U.S. Open, the PGA, and the Masters, the possessor of one of the finest tournament records in the game. And Gene Mittler, one-time national amateur champion, a former member of the Walker Cup and Ryder Cup teams, and the 1961 National Open champion. And to describe the action stroke by stroke, the legendary Gene Sarazen, holder of every major golf title. I'm George Rogers, and this is Shell's Wonderful World of Golf, a series of international golf matches played on the world's most famous golf courses. This week, Pine Valley, New Jersey.
At the suggestion of the editor of Golf in the US, who realized that her career prospects were limited due to her sex, she was advised to train as a tournament director. She assisted in several golf tournaments before being appointed to golf director for the United States Open Championship in 1964 at Congressional Golf Club in Washington. Over the next 20-odd years, Nancy was tournament director for 15 US Opens and 4 PGA Championships. She retired to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and in recognition of her services to golf, she was given lifetime membership of Southern Hills Country Club. She died in April 2013 at the age of 92. This oak tree is planted in recognition of Nancy Jupp's achievement in winning the British Girls Amateur Championship in 1934.
The growth of villages and towns has become inevitable with the pace of modern-day life, and the village of Longniddry is no exception. Often the fields and waters disappear as a result. However, for Mrs. Frances Cunningham, many key locations still tell of her family's history in Longniddry.
My grandparents farmed the land. My granny was more the housewife, but she provided the meals and meals to take out to the workers in the field and things like that. But they grew cabbages, cauliflower, but their main thing was the orchard. They had apples that were prolific. The orchard went right along here, but none of this vegetation was here. All of this has grown up. It was just a wall, and then beyond the wall was just the trees. So it had easy access to anybody that wanted to jump over and taste one of our delicious apples. But there was a few folk got away with it, but I'd like to say that not that many. But all these trees definitely are new. And, you had a clear view of all the old trees, and my grandparents were in the gardens for almost 100 years, their whole family. So they were probably 1860, from 1860 onwards, the trees. So this was our line of pear trees, and there used to be a burn running along this way. And to get the pears off the trees, we used to put tarpaulins over the burn, and then my father would climb up the tree and shake the trees so that the pears would all land on the tarpaulin, so it made them much easier to collect. My granddad used to hoe the land by hand, and the fields were quite expansive, but he actually used to go out with a hoe and hoe the drills. And record has it that if it was pouring rain, he had a corrugated iron sheet strapped to his back, and he used to go out there and hoe with his bonnet on. And his stuff all went to market. Crates, the lorries used to come to the local market in Edinburgh, so they would come down and take all the crated stuff away. So this is what we called our avenue, and the pillars are the original ones that were there all these years ago. Don't remember what the bits at the side were, but they must have had some use. And this leads up to the main road. And this is the way that this was the only way that we could get out the house. There was no other, the rest was fields, there was no other way out of the house. So they were synonymous for their plums. They actually got a royal warrant for having plums supplied to Holyrood Palace. And with the plums, they all had to be graded before they went. So my granny and some of the local ladies used to grade plums at the front door, and they also sold the plums to people that came to the door. And during the war, they would supply local people with food and everything. And there was always an open house if anybody needed fed. My grandparents were the ones that would feed them. This is Longniddry Gardens. It was the market gardens that my grandfather worked, and my great-grandfather before that, where I spent many happy years in my childhood. This is one of our sheds, and I have a picture of my great-grandfather standing here in front of it. This part was my granny's domain. This is where she kept her chickens, her little hens, and this was their coop. And they used to wander all about down here, laying eggs everywhere they wanted to. This is Longniddry House, and the preacher John Knox preached here many years ago. There's remnants of his preaching house in the gardens of this house. One of the boy that lived here and his family, the Broomfields, were the only neighbours that we had, and I used to play with their son. We used to play in the house and play in the gardens, and our claim to fame is that the pair of us used to sit in the stair and listen to stories from Ricky Fulton, the comedian.